So, banks are being investigated for spying on MAGA supporters post-January 6th. A recent investigation has revealed that at least 13 banks appear to have collaborated with federal agencies to monitor the financial transactions of hundreds of pro-gun and religious Trump supporters. This following the January 6th Capitol incident without proper warrants. Now, the House Judiciary Committee, led by Republican Jim Jordan, is probing these allegations, focusing on how the U.S. Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, and the FBI might have used indicators such as purchases of religious texts or searches for terms like MAGA and Trump to identify potential extremism. Now, the UK Daily Mail has published an exclusive this morning with the article titled, "How at least 13 banks may have worked with feds to spy on transactions of hundreds of pro-gun and religious Trump supporters after January 6th without warrants." Now, this article is written by John Rosh, and he writes that at least 13 financial institutions are being investigated by Republicans in Congress for colluding with the federal government to spy on Americans after the January 6 protests looking for extremism indicators. The House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, led by top Republican Jim Jordan, is investigating collusion between U.S. banks and federal agencies in the aftermath of the Capitol riot. The Biden administration, he writes, worked with banks to comb through, quote, extremism indicators, like the purchase of a religious text, like a Bible, or searches including the terms MAGA and Trump, according to shocking revelations by the committee. Now, the Daily Mail also points out that there are 7 other financial firms are also under investigation for ties to an FBI and FinCEN plot to spy on Americans' private banking transactions without first obtaining a warrant. Now, letters given out to these institutions was quoted as saying the committee and select subcommittee remained concerned about how and to what extent federal law enforcement and financial institutions continue to spy on Americans by weaponizing backdoor information sharing and casting sprawling classes of transactions, purchase behavior, and protected political or religious expression as potentially suspicious or indicative of extremism. Now, FinCEN, according to this article here, even suggested that banks review transactions at sporting and recreational supply stores like Cabela's, Dick's Sporting Goods, and Bass Pro Shops. Now, this, by the way, is part of a greater evil that is festering within our own government here in the U.S. We've already discussed in previous episodes here on this channel about the corporate fascism that has become commonplace within almost all social media platforms, with the most notable exception now is Twitter, now that the ownership has changed hands to Elon Musk. Let me take you back to an episode that I did on this channel back on March 19th, a little over a month ago. Now, in this episode, we were covering free speech cases that the Supreme Court have taken up. Take a look. Did the government's communications with social media companies amount to illegal attempts to informally censor speech on these platforms, thereby infringing on the expressive rights of the platforms and their users? The arguments are centering around the distinction between permissible government persuasion and impermissible coercion of private companies in content moderation decisions. Here is a sample of the discussion between Supreme Court Justice Alito and Brian Fletcher, who is the U.S. Principal Deputy Solicitor General. Take a look.
Exchanged between the White House and other federal officials and Facebook in particular, but also some of the other platforms. And I see that the White House and federal officials are repeatedly saying that Facebook and the federal government should be partners. We're on the same team. Officials are demanding answers. I want an answer. I want it right away. When they're unhappy, they curse them out. There are regular meetings. There is constant pestering of Facebook and some of the other platforms, and they want to have regular meetings, and they suggest, they suggest rules that should be applied, and why don't you tell us everything that you're going to do so we can help you and we can look it over. And I thought, wow, I cannot imagine federal officials taking that approach to the print media, our representatives over there. If you did that to them, what do you think the reaction would be? And so I thought, the only reason why this is taking place is because the federal government has got Section 230 and antitrust in its pocket, and it's, to mix my metaphors, and it's got these big clubs available to it. And so it's treating Facebook and these other platforms like they're subordinates. Would you do that to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Associated Press or any other big newspaper or wire service?
So there's a lot packed in there. I want to give you one very specific answer first and then step back out to the broader context. So specifically, you mentioned demanding an answer right away and cursing them out. The only time that happens is in an email that's about the president's own Instagram account. It's not about moderating other people's
Okay, well, put that aside. There's all the rest. Constant meetings, constant emails. We want answers. Right. We're partners. We're on the same team. Do you think that the print media regards themselves as being on the same team as the federal government, partners with the federal government?
So potentially in the context of an effort to get Americans vaccinated during a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And I really think that piece of context, it doesn't change the First Amendment principles, but it's relevant to how they apply here. And I think it's important to understand that at this time, this was a time when thousands of Americans were still dying every week, and there was a hope that getting everyone vaccinated could stop the pandemic. And there was a concern that Americans were getting their news about the vaccine from these platforms, and the platforms were promoting, not just posting, but promoting bad information.
I understand all that, and I know the objectives were good. But once again, they were also getting their news from the print media and the broadcast media and cable media, and I just can't imagine the federal government doing that to them. But maybe I'm naive. Maybe that goes on behind the scenes. I don't. But it struck me as, wow, this is not what I understand the relationship to be. That's all.
But I do. I think this is important because I have the same reaction that you do, that these emails look unusual. I think the idea that there'd be back and forth between the government and the media isn't unusual at all. When the White House press secretary on July 16th is asked about this by the press at the time, what she says is, of course we talk to the platforms just the way we talk to all of you when we have concerns about what you're doing, when we have information that you might find helpful. Now, there's an intensity of the back and forth here, and there's an anger that I think is unusual, but the context for that, I think, is that these platforms were saying publicly, we want to help. We think we have a responsibility to give people accurate information and not bad information, and we're doing everything we can to meet that goal. That's where this language of partnership comes from. It's not just from the White House. It's these platforms, which are powerful, sophisticated entities, saying we're doing the best we can.
So the U.S. government has been doing a full court press on erasing freedoms of American citizens in seemingly every way that they can, which is why this banking controversy story is such a big deal. So you might be asking, well, which banks are involved in this investigation then? Well, the financial institutions currently under investigation for their role in sharing customer data with law enforcement following the January 6th incident include the following. You have Bank of America, which has been accused of voluntarily providing lists of individuals who made transactions in the Washington area around the time of the January 6th protests. You have Citibank, which received a subpoena from the House Judiciary Committee demanding information about whether the bank handed over customer information to law enforcement following the Capitol 6th incident. The bank was issued this subpoena because they refused to voluntarily comply with the committee's earlier request for information. And then other institutions are JP Morgan, PNC, Truist, US Bank, and Wells Fargo. These institutions were listed and asked to provide information voluntarily by the House Judiciary Committee, although specific details of their compliance or the extent of their involvement have not yet been prominently discussed. So the next question then is, well, what is the purpose of this investigation? What are we going to potentially get out of this, right? Well, it's all about determining whether these institutions shared customer data with federal law enforcement without proper legal processes, and to assess the extent of this data sharing. Now, banks found to be in violation of financial privacy laws, such as the Right to Financial Privacy Act, or RFPA, can face a range of consequences, which include civil money penalties, enforcement actions, and legal costs. The RFPA was enacted to protect the confidentiality of personal financial records by creating statutory Fourth Amendment protection for bank records. It requires federal government agencies to provide individuals with notice and an opportunity to object before accessing their financial records, which of course did not happen here. Now, whether or not this action by this Republican or GOP committee will be enough to stop this from happening in the future, well, seems fairly doubtful to me. But I suppose you need to start somewhere, and this would be somewhere. And that, my friends, will bring this episode to a close once more. From the To Be Frank show, I am Adrian. Thanks for watching, my friends. I will see you all next time.